Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today we are rejoined by one of the fan favorites. It's none other than your favorite owl, Nightmare Vision. Nightmare, how are you doing today?
I am good. I am a classic cemented fan favorite. You can never take that away from me.
That's true. Some people like other people more. Like Blep Sama is starting to, inch ahead of you according to the comment section, even though he doesn't come on. Maybe it's the fact that he doesn't come on so often that there's this desire to see him more. They just see you so often that they don't think much of you. But I do have some good news for highly respected listeners out there. I've been accused of not having a lot of diversity on the show, but I want to inform everyone that Nightmare Vision is an owl of color. He is half Irish and half Italian, so I don't want to hear 100% POC. So I don't want to hear any more comments about how there's not enough diversity on here when I have Nightmare Vision on. So I just want to let listeners be informed of that.
I make this show woke. That's my preference.
In more ways than one. In more ways than one. But we have a lot to talk about today. Almost too much to talk about, but we'll try to keep this short and sweet. First topic we want to talk about, of course, is the big news. Nick Fuentes is no longer allowed to fly after being put on the no-fly list. And some people were, saying, "Oh, it's maybe just one airline," or "Oh, it's just something operated by the airlines. It's not TSA." No, we got confirmation yesterday that TSA was telling 3 different airlines that he was not allowed to fly and they couldn't let him check in. So it's pretty clear he's on some no-fly list operated by the TSA. So what do you make of this?
Well, I mean, just to get it out of the way, the type of person, we should be clear about like the type of person that is put on a no-fly list. So like, I mean, I'm deferring to you here, like specifically, like I'm under the belief that it was traditionally used for people who are like suspected of being like potential terrorist threats. Am I correct or no?
Yeah, that's correct.
So
it's like Al-Qaeda affiliates and stuff.
Yeah, like I'm sure, like I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was used like liberally and unfairly, in fact, in the 2000s against a lot of people who probably didn't deserve it. It was probably like painting with a broad brush against lots of people from probably Middle East, Muslims and stuff like that, who, whether you support immigration into the country from those parts of the world or not, I'm sure a lot of these people maybe weren't literal terrorist threats. But generally, the idea is that if you are on a no-fly list, the government considers you like a potential physical threat to the safety of the citizenry, right?
Yes.
So
yeah, I would say that.
So the implication
Nick Fuentes is now a physical threat.
Beards and neck.
His truth bombs are too much to handle on an airplane.
Yeah, and so it's very. I mean, maybe this is just like my own kind of. I don't know, like a pet peeve or whatever, but what's kind of interesting to me is that there's so much arguing online about like who constitutes like a threat to the system. You know what I mean? Like people are always kind of engaged in this fight. It kind of breaks along maybe not partisan lines, but like ideological lines between like right and left. And one of the things that almost always gets ignored in those discussions is like, who's actually being censored everywhere they go and all the time, because it's like really inconvenient for people who have this narrative that like, all like people like Nick Fuentes, like they're really, they're not like doing anything that's practically useful, or they're not engaging in anything that or advocating for any type of politics that like, people in power just don't really like. And I don't really know how you square that with things like this, where, I mean, this is like pretty extreme. I know that I saw like just really quickly, a lot of the reactions to it was this very like typical, this is like something we're all living with now. This kind of very glib dismissal by like libtards of like the encroaching, inwardly turned national security state that like it's pretty clear the writing on the wall is that Nick Fuentes and like other people like Ricky Vaughn are clearly like canaries in the coal mine for like a new paradigm in which basically the entire war on terror apparatus that started after 9/11 is going to be turned inward against the American people. And it's going to mostly be white Americans, you know, Republicans, Trump voters, etc. And Nick Fuentes in a lot of ways is like an inflection representing that, because, you know, he was out there calling out, you know, the election rigging with like Alex Jones and stuff. And he's also like just a very vocal Trump supporter in general, and also a huge critic of like mainstream conservatives. And so in a way, he kind of fits the bill for like the typical new target in this paradigm, with the exception that, you know, he's highly visible, which kind of makes him ideal to be like the first one. And yeah, so yeah, you like, I saw these glib dismissals and kind of like, you know, derisive mockery, like, oh, it sucks to be you. And this is just, you know,
a fuck around, find out was sound. And it's like, that's it's such a bootlicker thing. It's like, yeah, fuck around and find out that like the TSA, it's like, wow, like the badass TSA are telling you to go home, like fuck around, find out. I was pointing this out, is like, these libtards are the biggest bootlickers on planet Earth. Like there was this viral tweet saying like, from this woman who was like counseling, like, if two FBI agents show up at your place, you have every reason to talk to them, because the second FBI agent there is there to represent you, and they're going to make sure they get everything right. And it's this trust of authority and experts that, you know, they used to call themselves the resistance, but they like, if like anyone has a credential, it's like, I'm a health expert, you need to castrate yourself and stay double masked in your bathroom. They will follow along with that. And it's the same with like vaccines and stuff. It's like, even if you're vaccinated, you still have to be double masked outside. They are total cowards who worship authority and would never even dare question authority, yet they still see themselves as like the rebels and the resistance, when the only thing they're resisting is like the most persecuted people in the United States of America.
Yeah, they're piling on. They're basically kicking demographic while they're down, and then using this like this like media government contrived ideological apparatus that exists in between them and reality in order to like reinterpret themselves as the underdog, because it's essential to their like psychology for them to see themselves as, yeah, like rebelling against some sort of like authoritative power, when in effect what just happened was a YouTuber was just designated as a terrorist threat by the most powerful empire in the world right now. I mean, that's what happened. So
yeah, and they try to argue that it wasn't the empire. It was private enterprise just finding that he was rude, and you know, this is private enterprise telling you to stop being an asshole. It's consequence culture, as we'll go into in a little bit. That was doing it. I mean, there was this user Empty Wheel, who's been on MSNBC, was a person who was heavily involved in the Russia hoax and several other things that was just a national security asset. And this person was like, oh, it's not the TSA no-fly list. It's the airplane no rude list, you know, that Nick didn't follow the rules on masking, which is why he was kicked off the plane, which is why he's on the list, which, as Nick pointed out, like, you know, he had flown 8 more times after he had been kicked off a plane due to some mask dispute with an air stewardess, and that wasn't the problem. I mean, TSA could even use that as the reason, but that's just a pretext. I mean, they're clearly doing this. I mean, they may have just said, oh, well, we have this reason that we found out he's not wearing a mask on the plane, thus we're going to put him on a no-fly list, which I think they have threatened with some people. But the reason why they're doing this is because he's Nick Fuentes, not because he didn't like properly wear his mask on one airplane. It's because of his association with January 6th, because of his high visibility as a political dissident, as a right-wing commentator, that he's put on the list. They are punishing him, and they do see him as a threat, not just because, and they may just use that pretext of like the mass dispute as the reason, as their stated reason, but they don't need to give a reason like why you're on the list. I mean, the no-fly list, you know, you have to like do a very serious FOIA. You have to go through this whole procedures. I mean, there's no way of checking it. And I even saw liberals who like went to like fake scam sites and were like saying Nick Fuentes is not on this site, and then people would be like, it's not available, and they kept insisting that this site was the real thing. So these people will just accept authority no matter what. And even something that, 10 or 15 years ago would have been a major outrage to the public, that an American citizen was put on the no-fly list due to his political beliefs, is now a cause of celebration. They enjoy this. And it's the same mentality that I've talked about in several other podcasts, where they enjoy the cruel treatment dealt out to these January 6th protesters whose only crime is putting out their feet on Nancy Pelosi's desk or walking around the Capitol without permission. And they want prison guards to beat them into permanent disability. And they want them held like permanently for like the entirety of their lives. And these same people are the ones who believe Ma'Khia Bryant and other blacks who are wielding weapons should have just been talked down to and given a hug, and not even faced any consequences.
Yeah, and a lot of them are actually, they'll turn around the next day and they'll start talking about how they're prison abolitionists.
Yeah, the biggest prison abolitionists and police abolitionists are the biggest cheerleaders of the no-fly list being directed against white Americans, against police brutality against white Americans, against like indefinite detention of white Americans. Like that is like, they will even have that in their bio, but as long as it's directed against their political enemies rather than actual non-white criminals, they love the police state.
And a kind of similar hypocrisy here that is like very present in going back to the kind of glib, dismissive attitude towards being placed on a no-fly list is like the same people that'll make fun of like Nick for being put on a no-fly list are the same type of people who also unironically believe that he is a threat. Like they actually have like imbibed the state propaganda to the point where like they believe, like these people unironically use terms like, Nazi, fascist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, et cetera, like they believe this too. Which is like, so in other words, they're like, they've bought into, psychologically speaking, right? Like they've bought into this fear mongering. So it totally cuts across, it cuts against rather this kind of like nonchalant, fuck around and find out, you get what you deserve, blah, blah, blah. Because they've also bought into the actual panic. Again, just like, with the COVID thing and January 6th, like they've bought into the panic that the state has been propagandizing everybody with. They unironically refer to January 6th as an insurrection. All of this like hysterical lunatic tier analysis, and then they're going to turn around and they're going to celebrate things like if you showed up to the protest on January 6th, we're going to laugh at you over like potential like prison rape or being assaulted by wards of the state. And if you're Nick Fuentes, we're going to laugh at you for being placed on a no-fly list, but also we're going to like, solemnly thank our overlords for actually doing that, because Nick Fuentes is a real material threat to the safety of, people who live on the Upper West Side. And what kind of really strikes me about all this, Scott, is that this really is literally Sam Francis's concept of a narco tyranny. Like, the prison the defund the police, prison abolition advocacy combined with like this vehement desire for like a local police presence and also the federal national security state surveillance state to come down on their political enemies it's like he wrote it himself from like beyond the grave or something. Like we are heading to this point where like you were talking about, like these other criminals, like the girl with the knife, or George Floyd, and all these other figures are going to be looked at as like proof positive that we live in this white supremacist society and the state is this white supremacist evil construct that needs to be dismantled, but also at the same time with no pause or contradiction sensed this same state needs to be turned against our enemies, who mostly happen to be white people. And you're going to get caught in between those two absolutely contradictory positions. And my suspicion is that it's all going to give way to the second one. In other words, like, if I had to bet money now, I don't think we're going to abolish prisons. But I do think we are going to start, I do think we are going to start seeing people like Nick, or people at least starting to advocate seriously that people like Nick do go to prison. So like,
yeah, and they already do that. I mean, and some of them are on our own side because of their own petty disputes with Nick, and others is that they are supposedly on our own side, that they think that Nick should go to jail for inciting a riot. I saw that many people were saying that Nick should have already been arrested already for his comments out when he was outside the Capitol. He never went inside the Capitol. He was on the outside perimeter of it, where you're legally able to go, I guess. But and they even say that for his own free speech, he should go to jail. And this is the type of standard they want. And I even saw, like, in another point of anarcho-tyranny is that, there's these hard consequences for your free speech, or, if you're going into the Capitol without permission. At the same time, you can just read these stories from New York City or any major metropolitan area that's implementing these radical criminal justice reforms and see absolute nonsense. Like, I read the story that there was a black guy who was arrested earlier this month for attempted murder. He shot a guy during a robbery, and the guy lived, and they took like 2 months to arrest him, and they released him without bail. And like the day after they released him without bail, he nearly killed a cop who stopped him, and he dragged the cop along with his car. And this is the type of system, like, if you just absolutely, there's less consequences if you shoot somebody than if you advocate for advocate for law and order to be used against them.
But Scott, did one of the cops use the N-word?
Yeah, that's right. The guy can just claim the cop used the N-word. Well, he had a body cam on, so I guess they can't claim that. But yeah, there's all these consequences, and there's even other stories where you see any police shooting, even if the black guy is armed and charging at the cop, they believe that there should have been no consequences for this person. This person, no matter what crime they were doing, the police should have left them alone. But any speech crime is apparently necessary for consequences. So this is like American freedom. We always talk about oh, we're the freest nation in the world, but do you really feel free right now? And even not even just from the state, is that we have a volunteer Stasi out there, not just in the media, but just ordinary citizens who will videotape you for doing something wrong. I mean, there is 2 big examples of this from over the weekend. The first example is a Nashville health executive lost his job after he told a guy in a prom dress he looked like an idiot. And if you watch this video, they're at some downtown restaurant in Nashville, and clearly the prom party that the gay couple is in, where one of them is wearing a dress, was causing a ruckus. And this guy probably a few too many beers, and all he did was saying you look like an idiot. That's pretty much all he said. And this person was made viral video. Celebrities doxed him, his family, and his home address. And he lost his job, and his company, which he was the CEO of, said, we're going to do more to help LGBTQ plus causes due to this event, this grave offense that some 46-year-old guy who was having this prom party interrupt his evening just went up to him and said, hey, you look like an idiot, which the guy does. It's the truth. And the whole crowd just began mocking him and attacking him in the video. And the second video is even funnier, is that this black customer at a hotel was berating this poor hotel clerk who's masked up, and and apparently he had been using anti-gay slurs before he turned on the video. And this guy is just yelling at this dude, and it's over some minor mistake. And he's like, oh, you're gonna have a mental breakdown because I called you out. I got you right on video. And it's the fact that this white clerk, who is not even the one inconveniencing him, it's the hotel system, is the fact that like the black guy turns on the video camera just to show that like you are inconvenienced me, this is a major crime and I'm going to make you go viral to punish you for this minor error that is a result of the computer system, not due to your own fault. And the guy had like a mental breakdown, like he had like a whole temper tantrum due to the like pressure. And of course the black guy had no sympathy for him. And it later turned out this guy is gay and has mental health issues. And the only difference between these two scenarios is that the internet was more sympathetic to the hotel clerk because he was also himself a protected class by being mentally ill and gay. But still blacks saw him as the enemy just because he didn't willfully take his abuse that like some black customer was giving him. So, I mean, the point is of all these cases is that if you inconvenience or possibly offend any protected class, that warrants your whole life being ruined. But if you're like a criminal, like swinging a knife or throwing, you know, disrupting public order, you know, you don't deserve consequences. And if you ever talk about these things, like I tweeted out about how the guy getting fired by his own company is actual cancel culture, not like some politician getting criticism. And all these people are like, oh no, these are people holding him accountable for being an asshole. And it's like, yeah, no, it's not accountability culture because it's not an offense. Like in any society, we're going to have people who are not going to be 100% polite all the time. And if you're not to a protected class, your whole life is ruined and you are worse than an actual murderer or a rapist in the moral hierarchy. Now, those people may actually get more prison time, but according to the like prison abolitionists, police abolitionists left, those people shouldn't serve jail time. But like the health executive who said gay kid looked like an idiot, he deserves jail time.
Yeah, like we're all waiting for like the Liz Brunig piece. That's like this tearful bio of like a guy on death row and how like he's a victim of this racist system and like his family
he like burned alive some white woman.
Yeah,
and, like, and he's like, oh, I feel bad now. And it's like, and the whole case is like she pleaded for her life as he like beat her with a hammer. And it's like, yeah.
Anyone who mentions it in like her Twitter replies is like, get out of here, you troll. This is a troll. This is a troll trolling us with like evidence. And then like the second half of the piece will be about how like Nick Fuentes needs to be like summarily executed. Like that's like real like solidarity and subsidiarity. And like, but wait, Scott, do you remember the show Prison Break?
Yeah, I don't think I ever watched it, but yeah, I do.
Okay, so I'm picturing, for anyone who ever watched the show Prison Break, I'm picturing like a remake of Prison Break, but it's like the guy who laughed at the kid in the dress and the Holiday Inn clerk and Nick Fuentes they're all in prison, but then like, oh, like there's a new guy, and then they all turn and they see that like Baked Alaska has like intentionally gotten himself arrested in order to bust them all out of jail.
Yeah.
And so Baked just like the show, like Baked has like, you know, like they see Baked take his shirt off and he has like this like really elaborate body tattoo that's really like a map of the entire prison, and Baked Alaska's like, yeah, I'm gonna get you guys out.
I think that's great. I think that's our future. Yeah, no, that they should do that. But the problem is they couldn't rationalize. They couldn't show these evil, morally evil people as anything but good. But I think that would be a incredible show. It'd probably be even better than the original Prison Break. But this is like American freedom now. It's like you can't even go out without seeing something ridiculous. And if you don't sit there and mind your own business, like that was what all these people said about the health executive. He's like, he should have minded his own business, and that was the same story said with that Army sergeant who was arrested for gently shoving some black marauder in his neighborhood who kept assaulting women. And that's another case, is like the black guy suffered no consequences for like sexually assaulting women in the neighborhood, but the guy who confronted him and told him to stop is the one arrested, who had to flee his home, who's suspended by the Army and has to like face, has eternal name opprobrium due to what he did. That's once again that there's like a consequence culture only for whites, but in that case it's like mind your own business. Like that's only thing that whites should do is like if they see something wrong, you know, something intolerable, and if they're even if these people are coming up and harassing you, you just have to sit down, put your head down, and realize you're a second-class citizen because there's nothing you can do against these people. And yet this is American freedom, is that you have the right to watch your whole dinner get ruined by people. And if you do anything about it, your life is going to be ruined. So you just better keep your head down and be a good little servant to the system and realize these protected classes are superior to you. And that's the message of all these stories.
One of the things, Scott, that you notice in a lot of these cases is like, at least in the case with the that Army, what was he, an officer that had the people surround his house? And also the that CEO that was you know, laughing at or he said the kid in the dress looked like an idiot or whatever. Like in these cases, you're dealing with someone who's like clearly older, and they probably grew up prior to internet culture. They all look both of those guys. Oh, well, one looked older than the other, but let's just say they're both at least in their 40s or up, right? So they're like Gen X guys. They're not, you know, they probably didn't grow up with internet culture. And in both cases, like they're confronted with, you know, I kind of talk about this a lot, I find, but like, or at least I think it in my own head. But there's this like psychotic Zoomer culture that's out there that this generation is really doing the work in a lot of ways of like canceling. They don't really understand their own role because they kind of were incubated in this digital environment in which their entire self-perception is mediated through their phone screen. I mean, I don't want to sound like this kind of cliche, like put your phone down, man, like criticism or whatever. But on the other hand, when it comes to a certain cohort, people under a certain age, what I said is true. They really do mediate their entire self-image through apps on their phone and through their digital interconnectivity. And these guys are kind of like coming up against it in a way where like you almost get the feeling that they think they're still like, I'm not trying to attack their naivete really, but you know, there is a sense in which you kind of have an obligation to be a little bit more shrewd as this gets more visible and it gets worse, and it's going to get worse, where like they still think they're dealing with ultimately like, you know, physical interpersonal reactions with other people, you know what I mean? And like they don't realize that they're being used as fodder for a kind like a digital Zoomer mob that basically provides the material for justifying the informal punishment, which is what canceling is. That's why they use the term. It's because it's informal. So in other words, you're suffering in ways similar to being formally censored by a government, except something like prison, but it's happening through informal mediums, which is how people skirt around it and say absurd things like it doesn't exist, right? This is like part of the dishonesty of the entire system. But these like mentally ill Zoomers, TikTokers, etc., like people that kind of like grew up totally submerged in this environment, whether it's unconscious or not, I'll just say it's unconscious because most of them just look stupid as hell. They just look like they're really like, you know, like they would be specimens in like Nemitz's laboratory to find out like where they come from.
Yeah, and of course our listeners know who Nemitz is. Well, Nemitz has been on the show. He's an old friend, and you guys should definitely follow him. But he has really funny takes on racial combinations and others.
And so
definitely give him a follow.
These people, they provide like the material justification for this activity by making sure to film everybody's public activity, to, you know, become like hysterically engaged in something like, you know, I mean, Scott, I don't know how you feel about these things, but even if I've seen plenty of stuff online that has offended me, but it would never really occur to me to like participate in some sort of like mob activity in order to ruin like a private citizen's life based on like a video like that. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. In the same way, these these mostly, you know, like younger millennials and Zoomers, like just they seem to just unconsciously, they subconsciously gravitate toward this type of behavior. And it's like, if you get caught up in it, there's no real rhyme or reason to what's going on, because these people just take it as natural. And so as weird as they think it is, because in a way, the guy who says the kid in a dress looks like an idiot, there's like one sense in which he's clearly right. You know what I mean? There's one sense in which he's right. The kid looks like an idiot. It's a guy, and he's wearing a dress, and it's like stupid as hell, and it looks incredibly foolish. And the person doing it, even 10 years ago, if someone did that, you would think it was like a practical joke, or the person doing it was like mentally ill, and some of the pressure of that application does it, you know, it's like, who is an idiot grows out of the barrel of a gun. You know what I mean? Like, and if you have a bunch of psychotic Zoomers that are willing to blow you up, like just like that woman, I'm sure you've seen her TikTok videos shared on Twitter. There's that like problem glasses chick who goes around doxing anybody who says anything bad about like vaccines or COVID. Yeah. And she like totally deep dives into people's lives. Like, she's not a Zoomer. She's clearly like a older millennial. She's probably in like her late 30s, middle 30s. At least that's how she looks or whatever. It's like the same thing. Like, they want to apply a level of pressure so you feel profoundly uncomfortable now expressing what you take to be like, you know, normal kind of reasonable judgments or whatever. And eventually, like, they actually change what becomes normal and reasonable. And that's partly why I think that, like, you can characterize these people as like psychotic and or not it's definitely sociopathic, but like mentally ill Zoomers, because I see this on Twitter all the time. Like, they just take things like, you know, like transphobia or homophobia. They treat it the way normal people, like everyone who grew up before 2010 would treat like an actual like social faux pas, or like an example of like real impropriety, or like being rude. You would do, hey, what's your problem? Or like, what's wrong with that guy? And like, normally it would be like, you know, someone saying something like inappropriate or awkward or something that was offensive to somebody else. But now they're like, it's like a transvaluation of values, right? Like, now that kind of outrage at a social faux pas is being now successfully, as far as I could tell, it's being successfully applied to these like ideological constructs. And so now it's like, you see that kid in a dress, like, well, yeah, like in the past, we used to say that kid looked like an idiot, but like now in the new
not allowed to say that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
you're actually supposed to think that person is brave and courageous. You're supposed to clap for him, and the snitch culture is rewarded.
Yes,
like, society thanks these voluntary Stasi for their work, and it is like operating as a soft totalitarianism. I know that's cliche, but this is how we operate. I mean, the same way in these Warsaw Pact countries that they celebrated informants, you know, turning in their neighbor for not being sufficiently loyal to the Communist Party. It's the same that we now have with these psychotic Zoomers. We celebrate them for like, thank you for your courageous work in like exposing this person who doesn't salute the flag of Black Lives Matter. And that's the system we operate under. And then this is like our new level of freedom that we have. And, you know, there's not really a way of escaping. I mean, I agree with your point that like these are, and it's really happening with like Gen Xers and Boomers who just like don't understand this internet culture. But this is, you know, this is the country we live in. And I also find that like conservatives don't really, they don't stand up for these people. And this is like the real cancel culture that any ordinary American can suffer under. Is like, you could just be going around in your business, but you commit like some faux pas to leftist orthodoxy, and your whole life is ruined. And they don't care. Instead, they care about like some Hollywood celebrity who's like, I stand with Israel. And it's like, this person's getting canceled by Hamas. Like, no, they're not getting canceled. They still have their job. They still have their reputation. They're still allowed on social media. That's not cancel culture at all. And they never stand up for these people. And at the same time, like, you can't really weaponize it against people on the left who say incredible things. Like there's a Stanford student senator who openly called for the extermination of white people. and you know, nothing is ever going to happen to this person. And when there is like some like quote unquote online backlash against this person will definitely receive an article in like Vice or Huffington Post about how they were a victim of like this right-wing harassment machine, and their like whole life was ruined because like some internet gripers told them like, you're an idiot for thinking that that you want to exterminate white people, but they will overlook what happened to their initial statement. So a lot of good things going on in America. I guess that's.
Let me just say two things real quick, Scott. I think people should be paying attention to the kind of warping, or I guess it's already happened now, the warped sense of social responsibility that is now like creeping into the public consciousness. Like, and it's very important, I think, for people on the right to pay attention to this, because I actually sympathize with kind of like the rhetoric of social responsibility, but like as it manifests in the real world, not in like the fantasies of ideologues, right? So like what's going on now is like, you know, when you think that, you know, an increased level of social consciousness and social responsibility, like you think it means like, you know, people getting divorced less, right? Like parents being good parents to their kids, or like you knocking on like your neighbor's door to see if like, oh, like I'm going to the store, do you want anything? Or like, you know, something as cliche as like helping an old lady across the street, like actual manifestations of like social responsibility that make a place, that improve your environment, that make a place better to live, right? And what's happening in America, and I see this a lot from news coming out of England. I feel like England is like the greatest example of this right now. And I feel like America is becoming like this, where like they have this totally, utterly perverse concept of social responsibility, where all of their social relations have essentially been completely shattered. And they're kind of consciously, artificially reconstructed by the state apparatus, where the new interpretation of social responsibility becomes a kind of unquestioning collectivist loyalty to state bureaucracy and institutions. And that's what we're getting hit with now. So like you're getting bombarded with this propaganda that like, oh, like you're an asshole, you're not being socially conscious. And it's like, oh, what happened? Did I just walk by this old lady at a green light while there's like a ton of traffic going on? It's like, no, you didn't get vaccinated, or you're refusing to.
You're not double masked right now.
Yeah, you're not double masking, or you're not participating in this digital mob trying to ruin somebody's life. Like, or like you're not vegan, you still eat meat. Like there's this total, like, I know I keep using this word, but it's really important. This like ideological reinterpretation of what are normally decent concepts. You know, everyone should be socially conscious in a way that they're like concerned with the well-being of like their neighbors, their family, their countrymen, right? This is what patriotism really is in a normal, natural sense. But now we have this like new bastardized interpretation of these. And so you're getting bombarded with these, and it almost like wants to turn you into like this like crazed libertarian. And this is kind of what feeds into this debate that never goes anywhere, because it's taking place on such bad faith and insincere terms. Like the idea that like you don't exhibit social responsibility unless you are also like manifesting this kind of fear-mongered hysteria over like COVID, or over this like new category of social faux pas, like who's a transphobe or who's being racist, et cetera, et cetera. But these are not real. Like we know this, you can see this online. Like the people who are, it's precisely the people who are highly obsessed with this type of social responsibility who absolutely fail to manifest it in the normal way. So it's like, you know this, it's like journalists who are terrible people who would stab their own family members in the back just for a tiny crumb of clout. They're lecturing the rest of the population on how like what terrible people they are, because it's like, oh, look, this guy confronted like somebody in his own suburban neighborhood, right? Or like something like that. And like the other thing I wanted to say really quick is that the other thing you mentioned is like, yeah, like the idea that it's like the the real energy behind opposition to canceling people, it's constantly being like cannibalized by conservative pundits for their own insincere ends. And so, yeah, like you just said, like, you know, you won't see anyone defend this guy, or, well, the Holiday Inn guy, he actually is being defended, but it doesn't really work.
It's because he's a protected class himself. It's not because of
so no one protects exactly. So no one's protecting like someone like this. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's like, oh, like someone like Gina Carano, or I don't know, is that her name? The woman who was on the Mandalorian.
Yeah, that is it. And they'll use examples like Kevin Williamson losing his Atlantic column as an example of cancel. It's all dealing with their stuff in their own career, in their own social circle that they drum up, or stuff like Dr. Seuss, which, I mean, I guess it is like somewhat interesting that like now Dr. Seuss is too controversial to read, but they like turn this into like a civilizational threat when like there are far bigger things to worry about than Dr. Seuss books like not being shown in the Loudoun County Public Library.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
But
so it trivializes cancel culture in a way that it makes it seem that liberals can then just like, you know, make fun of it. Like, oh, this isn't, oh yeah, you just care about like Dr. Seuss and stuff. But it's not like about how, you know, there's this social revolution going on where normal people have to tolerate all types of indignities and craziness. And if they ever get out of line, they could just get their whole lives ruined. And it becomes, you know, and it goes with you for the rest of your life. And so your whole, like, you got all these plans, like this health CEO, you know, he's got all these plans in his life, probably a father and a family man. And that's all gone now because of just one offense that they found. And they need to highlight this more. So,
but I think it's important to not just point out that conservatives do this, or like, you know, someone like Bari Weiss, or is like, she's another good example, right? Like she's a classic example of this, where like one of the things I noticed online is that there's a lot of people out there who essentially form their personality in opposition to this kind of like very visible conservative commentariat. And in a way, they're kind of like feeding. It's funny because a lot of these people, they self-describe as leftists, and they'll tell you things like, oh, like, I don't pay attention to the culture war. This is a culture war distraction. That's a culture war distraction. But in a way, the irony here, which is interesting to me, is that they are in a way useful tools for the culture war, because they, and I see this by some people on the ostensible right too, they form their opinions in like direct contradistinction to like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder,
whatever Fox News is saying.
Yeah, whatever Fox News is saying. And so what happens is like, so there's like a real phenomena that is being positively advocated for by people. Like I've seen this with like, you know, trans rights. If anyone is interested in this, they should read the book, The Transgender Industrial Complex by Scott Howard. It's an excellent book that documents all of the funding going into this, all of the NGOs and government organizations and hedge fund billionaires that are supporting this. And it's not just this one issue of like LGBT stuff. It's all the stuff that get people canceled generally. It's the race stuff. This is all being propped up. It's all being supported and bankrolled by people that have wealth and prestige and power. And they're the ones that are creating these issues. And then, yeah, like, okay, Ben Shapiro starts talking about it, or like some Fox News blonde starts talking about it. And then you have like these, like the irony cell shitheads on Twitter. They'll be like, oh, this isn't real. Someone I think is like a low IQ white person mentioned it. Therefore, it's like totally a fantasy.
But what's important is JFK assassination and Patrice Lumumba getting executed. You know, these things that happened 60 years ago are way more important and time sensitive. And also the CIA, like the powers that be do not let you criticize the CIA. That's why there's an anti-CIA movie made by Hollywood every year. You know, this is the real controversial stuff. But if you publish an anti-trans book, you're going to get banned from Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you do politics in 2020 and literally get kicked off the internet or put on a no-fly list, that's culture war. But like politics of like the late 1960s and the 1970s that nobody's around anymore from it, that's like the cutting edge. That's the real dangerous stuff.
Yeah, the CIA will kill you if you criticize the CIA. That's why they're like everyone in media criticizes the CIA and it's still alive.
This is kind of like a rule. This is kind of like a rule of thumb for me. It's like a general rule. It shows how, like, I used to see people talk about this, how like it's like everyone basically is like constantly playing catch up to like anonymous 2015 Twitter, and like we like, or like at the time, everyone was paying attention to the conservative commentariat, right? Like it was literally like every day you were just going on Twitter to bully like National Review writers and to go into their comment section and savage them. Like that's part of the reason all of these conservative websites got rid of their comment section, and like only like Breitbart kept their comment section. So in 2015, it was relevant because you needed desperately to point out how these people are leading their audience astray, and they're doing a disservice to people, and they're kind of like they're supporting really bad things, and oftentimes for really kind of like bad faith motives. But now, as far as I could tell, I mean, I don't want to say like it's an iron rule or whatever, but I do see this. I feel like to the extent that you're constantly paying attention to conservative pundits, or not just paying attention to them, but to the extent that like you're intentionally trying to form your opinion in opposition to them, I find that the people who do this now are disgruntled and wrong almost all the time, because what they're doing is they're taking an issue that has an actual grain of truth to it. And it's like the same thing with like QAnon. Like they're taking grievances that are legitimate and a kind of dissatisfaction with the current status quo that is legitimate, and they're trying to associate it with people that they feel are popularly judged as like low status and low class, as a way to like delegitimize the issue. And so like, yeah, if you can put this argument in the mouth of like Ben Shapiro or like, you know, Kevin McCarthy, like this is what I said the last time when we were talking about like the Dr. Seuss thing. Like if you can put these very real issues into the mouths of like, yeah, Bari Weiss, etc., like, yeah, like you can like just dismiss it as like, oh, this isn't real. This is culture wars. Oh, it's for selling like, you know, Brain Force or My Pillows and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, that stuff's all real. But frankly, at least as far as I can tell, you can pay attention to what's going on without having to give almost any airtime to the conservative commentariat. Like they basically don't factor in at all. They're not responsible for advocating massive sweeping cultural changes. They're not writing law. They're not advocating for policy. I don't really know what purpose you know, NRO writers still serve. I mean, I still don't like them, and I still think that making fun of them is, you know, entertaining, and sometimes it's gratifying, but I don't see what role that these people serve in the functional distribution of power in this country. And so I think that the people that pay attention to them way too much and form opinions in opposition to them, I think that that's like it's like a bit of a disingenuous tactic. It's like a way of distracting from the actual changes that are going on, like the examples that we were talking about at the opening of this segment, where like, okay, like, is that not real? Like, did that person lose their job or keep their job? Did that person get a mob show up outside their house or not? Like, I don't actually care what David French has to say about it. Like, did it happen or not? And if it did, then like, what happened to all your irony if it's real? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what kind of response is that?
Yeah, and that, you know, that actually brings up a good way to veer into our next subject. If you brought up David French and kind of how these conservative people aren't relevant anymore, is that, you know, even though you weren't necessarily using you were using David French as more of a stand-in for like standard, like National Review pundit, which he's now more like into the realm of just like a never Trumper who supports every Democratic policy except for like religious freedom and I guess abortion. But there is a segment of you know, the post liberals. I get there's not a really good term for it. This is leading to an article we both read about the problem with what this author called the new right. There's not a really good term for it. I like using the term post liberals because it is like a way, that's what they call themselves, and it is like a snarky way of attacking them, because many of them end up not actually challenging anything that liberals care about. It's just like an intellectual masturbation that they get into, where they imagine that the real threat to the liberal order is calling for an industrial policy or like some tax credit for like black families to have more kids, and they believe that this is the real threat to the post-liberal order. But they love using David French as a way to separate themselves from the past conservatism, but in a lot of ways it becomes an overcorrection. But we'll go into that with this subject that we're talking about. So switching gears, as I said, there was a very interesting article that both Nightmare Vision and I read over the weekend. It was written by one Tanner Greer, no relation to Scott M. Greer, the only Greer there should be, besides my own family.
Two Serbians.
Serbians, yeah, with Scottish last names, yeah, absolutely. He's a right-leaning scholar, independent scholar. It's tough to find a lot of background on him, but a lot of people read him and follow him. He seems to be pretty smart. I read a bunch of his articles. Anyway, in this latest article he wrote called The Problem of the New Right, which there's like a million new rights, but the new right he uses is like Yoram Hazony, Adrian Vermeule, Sohrab Ahmari, people like that. He argues that the new right or post-liberals or whatever don't get their constituency. They believe the Trump base is statist and very anti-libertarian. He finds that it's the opposite. He writes, quote, "The new right critique of the American tradition assumes that liberalism and libertarianism are rationalist abstractions foisted by ideologues onto an unsuspecting people. America's libertarian tracts were foisted on no one. Rather, they are simply an attempt to articulate the language of philosophy, the common sense attitudes and practices long embedded in the customs of the people themselves." He also adds later on in the piece, "The libertarian streak of the median Trump voter is not refined or well-reasoned. It is more of a product of instinct than intellect. It is the impulse that caused backcountry men to cry for elbow room 2 centuries ago, causes modern Trumpists to yell, 'Get off my lawn' today," and led both groups to embrace the slogan, 'Don't tread on me,' when they felt like their way of life was under siege. Andrew Jackson became president because he honored white working men yelling for elbow room, promising to use his power to fight haughty East Coast elites that seemed too eager to dictate to the backcountry men how they ought to live. Donald Trump was voted into office by the cultural descendants of these people, and for all the same reasons. Trump's decision to hang a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office was a tacit acknowledgement of this reality." I found a lot of the points convincing in this article that essentially said that, like, the post-liberals' imagination of the white working class that voted for Trump is wrong. What did you think of it, Nightmare?
I did enjoy the piece overall. I think that like it talked about a lot of things that I think are relevant for the kind of discourse that you see. I guess, yeah, you describe it as like post-liberal. Like it does kind of touch on a lot of these threads where people are essentially trying to forge like a coherent, an intellectually coherent right wing in the wake of like what everyone feels is this kind of catastrophic collapse of any old type of conservatism or like the Reagan coalition, and any kind of like serious opposition to contemporary liberalism. And so like I think that there are a lot, there are kind of a lot of oversimplifications that get made, and there are a lot of people that kind of have their own little ideological axis to grind, who they kind of like overinterpret things in order to have it correspond to what they wish this new kind of right wing would look like. But there is my main criticism of the piece, which I think does apply to a lot of discussion that I see about this, is that, the author of this piece, he uses libertarianism, I feel like, in a kind of equivocal way, meaning that he wants you to think of libertarianism in like the political ideological sense, but then he wants to apply that term to like, you know, Trump voters and, you know, a certain swath of like white America. But I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. You know what I mean, Scott? Like I don't think that the libertarianism, quote unquote, of, you know, the average like Republican voter, or yeah, someone who has like deep ancestry in like the Midwest and other parts of the country, deep American ancestry, I don't think that that libertarianism really matches one-to-one with what we call like libertarianism, like Beltway.
Oh, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think it's like a lack of a better term. I mean, this is like when people think libertarianism, they think Cato and they think all the goofiness that was associated with the libertarian movement of the 2010s. And it is something very different. It is like a muscular, common sense libertarianism. I mean, it's not Ayn Rand. It's essentially like they see the government and the state as these dumb liberal bureaucrats who make their lives worse, which in a lot of cases we've seen over the COVID. Now, some of this is taking this as like the overall philosophy is that your overall political philosophy matters nothing more than get off my lawn and that people can live in peace. I think there are problems with that. It has to be, these people have that attitude, but there's also a sense of there is a collective identity. It's not well formed, but there is an idea of what America should be like. And this author, Tanner Greer, mentions that a lot of these people, they're like, well, it doesn't make sense. These people are like pro-military and anti-immigration. And yeah, that all makes sense with their libertarianism, even though we really need to wean them off their pro-military streak. It is good that we're making them more anti-immigrant. And there is a sense of like, we're the real Americans. Now that doesn't, and they would see a lot of these ideas proposed by post-liberals as just like the nanny state interfering with their way of life and making it more libtarded, which in a lot of ways, the way the state operates in America, unless there is like completely radical changes, you're putting awfuls and like DMV people in charge of like white Americans telling them what to do. And if you want to look at what the biggest revolt besides Stop the Steal stuff was for the Trump base, it was over lockdowns. Like we had massive protests over the lockdowns, and there was this huge upsurge of people who demanded, I am not wearing a mask. Like I'm not following these stupid rules. I'm going to go protest to my state capitol over this. And this really, you know, agitated people and made them take action, which, you know, previous things haven't. Now, if these people were naturally wanting more state involvement of what the post-liberals would want, they would love the mask mandates. And a lot of these post-liberals liked it, mask mandates at first, but then they realized like, oh, our whole constituency hates this. And they went against it. And this is what really motivates them, is that, you know, if they see the nanny state forcing them to do something for the quote unquote common good, as like their key word among post-liberals is the common good, they're going to hate it because they're like, this is stupid. Like, why am I wearing a mask out in rural Michigan? You know, I'm not around anyone on my farm. You know, this is like the feeling that they had. And I think that does show this libertarian streak, but it is not the libertarianism of Cato Institute where they want like, you know, sex workers to, you know, be legalized, or they want everyone doing heroin, or, you know, they're really concerned about police stopping frisking black criminals. You know, a lot of times, like a lot of these people who have libertarian tendencies, who are the natural white middle Americans, you know, they're opposed to drug use. They support the police. They have Blue Lives Matter gear, etc. They don't like liberal bureaucrats telling them what to do. And I think a lot of what post-liberal statism is, it's an overcorrection against the stupidity of conserving, of like celebrating the free market as like the highest good, of just like imagining that the real problem is big government, and avoiding any type of mention of like America's natural identity or its historic identity and historic traditions. And really the only point of the Republican Party is to ensure big corporations get tax cuts. I understand like you know, wanting to revolt against that, but post-liberals are overcorrecting, and they're ignoring the most important aspects of Trumpism, which is the cultural and racial identity aspects of the Trump base, which is what really motivated them. Make America Great Again was an implicit, racial appeal. It was like, make America look like us again. That's what these people heard. And if you look at all these studies, there was a great study I've talked about in previous podcasts, produced in November by the Center for Studies on Partisanship and Ideology, that showed that Trump voters were far more motivated by white identity issues such as immigration and et cetera, than they were by economic nationalism. Like any of these wonky policies proposed by post-liberals, Trumpists don't care about it. Their only concern is whether it improves the economy. They don't care whether it's libertarian ideas or it's something that is total state intervention that's improving the economy. They just want the economy to improve, and whoever's doing it, they support. But ultimately, what made them vote for Trump was these appeals to white identity, not economic nationalism. And that's just something they don't understand. But they don't want to, because they want to create this status ideology that's imagining this great America, but it's shorn of all of what identity and what people it is. And they imagine that the stereotypical Trump voter is some, I've mentioned this stereotype before of the integralist, that it's some rosary carrying union worker in Wisconsin who's driving his pickup truck, and his main issues are abortion, euthanasia, and industrial policy. And he's praying his rosary before work, and then he's going to his factory that was shut down in the 70s, but for some reason he's still working there. And this is their ideal working class. And it's a total fantasy. The ideal Trump voter is these people who are self-employed, would be considered middle class in their areas. And they generally have traditional right-wing economic policies, but they're fine with the state interfering to stop tech censorship, and they're fine with trade protectionism and these other things. But in terms of they don't want right-wing socialism.
Well, I don't even know if necessarily that's what I mean. I feel like these terms are so imprecise. Like you say, they don't want right-wing socialism, but I mean, right now there's a lot of government policy that's actively undermining the well-being of the American citizen. And so it's would undoing that be libertarianism, or would doing the opposite of that be a form of right-wing socialism? I don't know, but I'm sure that you could get all these people to support it. I mean, Trump did, you know what I mean? And Trump was also the least ideologically libertarian candidate running in the primary in 2015, and he won fair and square. He did really well. So I think that there's this rush to kind of put labels on things. I don't know, would these people would they have huge objections to increased social spending or infrastructure spending if they had a confidence that it like you were saying, it was being done by a good breed of leadership that they felt had,
and they know it was benefiting them. It wasn't going to minority communities. Yeah, I think they probably would. But the problem is the state as it operates is designed to help non-whites, and even the family policies that these guys propose, these integralists propose, it's all about helping non-white families have more kids. It's that's not the point. That's not the problem we're having in America, and that's what they want to solve. And they're just empowering liberal bureaucrats to continue doing what they do. And I think it was right to attack libertarians, but I think now bashing libertarians, you really are beating a dead horse. They are irrelevant to the discussion. They have no power within the GOP. They don't really. I mean, CNN may have a Cato writer on occasionally, but no one pays attention to them. I mean, it is they're we have to attack libertarians, which, saying that in 2014 or 2015 was important. Saying it in 2021 when they're completely irrelevant, it's just a easy pickings.
I said this on the last, maybe not the last show, but on previous show that you had me on for, that the libertarian serves as a rhetorical shield for the state. We don't actually have libertarian policies in this country. We have massive government intervention in the daily lives of citizens. It's just terrible, and it does the opposite of what's good for the citizenry. It like intentionally privileges foreigners or like minority populations in an attempt to like kind of stoke grievances, like from amongst the citizenry, like to kind of like foster hostilities and things like that. So it's not like we have this libertarian paradise and like, you know, you're like bravely saying we need a tax system for the common good or something like we already have like a massively punitive system. And one of the problems I don't really see people address that kind of should be addressed is that, like, you know, the idea that people just kind of naturally flocked, so to speak, to like into the arms of big business and like woke capital. It's a little bit of like a misdiagnosis of what happened. Like people, part of the reason people kind of began to like trust brands and stuff like that, or people do have like a large trust in like corporate brands. Like you see this all the time. Like the average person I'm talking about, like normal people have an immense trust in like brands and things like that. A lot of that kind of comes in the wake of them no longer trusting the state or like the government and stuff like that. Like there's a kind of inverse relationship there. And so I think that trying to answer one with the other, in some cases, I think it does work, but to see one as like a cure for the massive presence of the other is, I don't know how much traction that will get long term, because like you were like, it's easy to imagine, like people use this term woke capital all the time, but like the government's woke. Like the, you know, like the idea that like you're going to exchange. Okay. Like I get it. Like nobody wants the Amazon warehouse in their neighborhood with Jeff Bezos dictating policy. But the idea that that's happening in a vacuum without any type of like state guarantee or cooperation is like a kind of fantasy that everyone's buying into, as far as I can tell now. When in reality, there's kind of like just one thing. It's not like state versus corporation. That's not really how it's working here. And so to the extent that we want to see these things in opposition, yeah, we start to have faith in one over the other. And like you said, like now the swing is in the other way, and the anti-libertarian rhetoric is kind of in full swing now on the quote unquote new right. And like there is a certain reality that it's capturing, yeah, but at the same time, it's, yeah, like to the extent that it misses the fact that we like these aren't like essentially two bodies in opposition. They're unified in their kind of undermining of the American citizen. And so whatever has to come, whatever comes next has to have a much more comprehensive understanding of that. And it does include a kind of realistic appraisal of what this like this new base of power, like the Trump vote or whatever, what they actually would support, rather than what you wish they would support in like, you know, in a vacuum, you know?
Yeah, and I think I mean it is a case of putting the cart before the horse. They haven't defined who they are fighting for. I mean, they imagine this multiracial working class fantasy that doesn't exist, instead of like the actual Trump voters and who are they fighting for. And I always say this is like we have to be standing up for our people and not like imagining like all these policies that people propose, like, oh, we got to have student loan debt for forgiveness. That's once again helping out like awfuls and white urban liberal professionals. It's like helping out unions. You're helping out the main base of like the Democratic Party, and all these things. It's like you imagine that these are our people, but they're not, and you propose all these policies against our people because you ultimately both the like new right and the woke left, and I guess the dirtbag left have this anti-middle class mentality, mostly because they come from the upper middle class themselves. So and then in order to compensate for that, they imagine that they represent a fantasy working class that no longer exists for both the left and the right. People who constantly talk about the working class and saying they stand for the working class. Usually most of these kids are like, their dad was a corporate lawyer in New York, and they're like, dad helps pay their rent and stuff. And like, they're not a working class at all, but they do love to signal against the bourgeois, the evil middle class. And then they propose all these policies when it's like, in fact, that actual middle class, not necessarily like some of these white suburbanites, But like, you know, people in exurbs and even some of these people in the suburbs are still like our people. I mean, it is like more like younger white suburbanites that are the problem, and particularly women as well.
Yeah,
and they imagine that we should work to hurt their interests and then help the interests of imaginary allies who are actually our enemies.
Exactly. And then you get caught up in this where, I mean, not you personally, actually you personally do, but I was like, you know, you generally, you get caught up in this like, oh, well, like, oh, you don't support student loan forgiveness, or you don't support like unions. Oh, you must be one of those libertarians. Like, we got rid of you in 2015. And it's like, or it's like on the, you know, on the other hand, if you do support these things, like you're a socialist and now you're like a based right-wing socialist because you support those things. And again, like so everyone's obsessed with which direction you're signaling rather than like the reality on the ground and like what the tangible effects of the policy would be. So it's like, well, student loan forgiveness wouldn't actually help the people you're saying it would help. So opposing it doesn't make me like a libertarian. It like, listen to what I'm telling you is going to happen if you do this. And it's the same thing with unions. I saw this discussion. I saw it on your Twitter where like, yeah, people were trying to act like, oh, like you're a corporate apologist. You're against unions. It's like, no, unions today are corporate apologists. Like the most pressing concern of a union today is to like root out transphobia, not like, you know, mid 20th century, like labor protections and stuff like that. And so like one of the problems, Scott, that I feel like is constantly haunting these discussions is like, yeah, people want to know like, oh, like, are you libertarian? Are you socialist? Are you nationalist? Are you Marxist? And you have to like label yourself with this like overdetermined self-branding. But I just want to, can I just, I saw this tweet yesterday from, what was the Twitter account? Do you know Melissa Chen? Is she like a lunatic journalist? I think she might be, right?
I don't really. I maybe I am vaguely familiar with the name.
So there's this tweet I saw yesterday, right? And it's from Melissa Chen. And so someone working for the, you know, the tin pot administration, bureaucratic millennial administration that's ruling over us after they stole the election in last November. Someone working for these people was asked about the whether they were going to like ship raw materials for vaccines to India, right? Because now there's this like completely astroturfed and I suspect artificial mass genocide going on because of COVID in India. That's like all the rage. Everyone's talking about it, right? And so anyway, this official says, I quote, "We have a special responsibility to the American people." Okay. This woman, Melissa Chen, do you know how she describes that statement? We have a special responsibility to the American people. She says, this is her tweet, "This is the kind of America First jingoism that Trump was always excoriated by the media for." Okay. So the reason I'm reading that tweet is because I want to illustrate this point. Okay. People keep trying to come up with like these terms, like, you know, people will use nationalism. I get it. But it's an anachronism, right? People aren't literally advocating for like, you know, 19th century nationalism as like the cure for what ails us, right? And it's the same thing with a lot of people on the left. Not really as many as there used to be, but people that describe themselves as like Marxist, blah, blah, blah. And everyone's looking for a term to describe the opposite of what that woman just said. Okay? Yeah. Because the problem, and this is like my like uninformed take on it, right? Because I don't really have a dog in a lot of these historical fights over these terms or whatever. But it's, people don't want to admit that we actually don't have a term for like normal human government. Like we want to call it nationalism, or we want to call it like right-wing socialism. We have all these terms that we want to use because what we really want to say is that when a government tells you that they have a special obligation to their citizens, that isn't right-wing America First jingoism, Nazism, white supremacy. That's called being a normal country. Okay.
Yeah.
And so all these people keep using these overdetermined phrase. Oh, we're going to talk about the common good, or we need to be Catholic integralists. I get it. I like some of that stuff. I'm Catholic too. I'm attracted to a lot of that thought. But I think people really are kind of missing the bigger picture here, is that what you really want, what everybody who's arguing all day about these terms really wants, is for the government, when it does something, they want the government to ask first, how does the thing we're about to do benefit the American people? And like, we don't really have a term for like what that describes. Like, people call it nationalism, but it really isn't, because it's just being normal. And what people don't want to admit is that for decades now, the United States government has been operating on the exact inverse of that premise. And the reigning ideology, no matter whatever you call it, Marxism, liberalism, social, I don't care what you call it, whatever it is, it operates on the direct assumption that what we should be doing should be the thing that does not benefit our own citizens. And that's what really everybody wants to go away. Just please have a coherent concept of the national interest that we can use as a criterion to measure the policies and the actions of our government. And all of the journalists and all of the officials and all the academics and all the lawyers that run interference to prevent any type of concept like this from emerging, the reason why they don't want it to emerge is because they know, and we know, that the government would fail that test by any sane metric. It would absolutely fail it. And like, all of these arguments kind of pale in comparison to this basic question, which is like, can we please just have a government that we're allowed to evaluate according to whether what it's doing benefits us or not? And people don't want to admit it because it's so extreme that the resounding answer from all the halls of power is no.
Yep. And that is the key point, I think. And also that, and even the people who are being highlighted as like offering the answers to that are mostly involved in just posturing and posing that it's not actually answering that question. And even on the central issues of our time, they largely remain silent. As in, like, none of these new right intellectuals are talking about the persecution happening to January 6th protesters. None of them talked about Nick Fuentes yesterday. None of them talk about even anything that's happening with anti-white racism or the critical race theory stuff. Some of them talk about that, but they really do believe that the real important issues is matters of making the state bigger to work for these poorly defined right-wing objectives, which if maybe bigger state policy is the answer, but if you don't know what you're fighting for or what people who you're fighting for, it's completely pointless. All these people call themselves Schmittians, yet they forget the friend-enemy distinction, and they think their friends are their enemies and their enemies are their friends. And this is a major problem with the new right, and it is like just simply something, it's really, you just want something, a movement to argue something as simple as you said, is like, we're putting the American citizens first. That's our only obligation, and that's what we need to promote as our ideal political philosophy. It's that simple. It's not complicated. You don't need to cite de Mistra or any of these 18th century or 19th century reactionary writers. You don't need to talk about the undefined common good. You just need to talk about that, and that's it. And I think that would be the new right. And
that gets you called a Nazi, by the way. Like, I love reading Dmitri. I enjoy him or whatever. But the idea that this is like too obvious to serve as the basis of something as an alternative is wrong. Because if we see this, like, if you do say that you want this new standard for judging these, you get called a Nazi by journalists on Twitter. If you say like, oh, well, I want things that directly and primarily benefit the American people before, aliens, foreigners, other governments, foreign bodies, NGOs, international organizations, supranational bodies, like you get called like a reactionary Nazi, and like Movie Bob comes in your mentions and tells you that you need to go die from like an opioid overdose. Like,
Yeah.
it is like literally controversial. So the idea, in other words, that we need to overdetermine it with all of these other alternatives, it's like, it's an interesting academic discussion maybe, but it's actually not tangible because, yeah, this very basic question is actually highly contested by everybody who wields institutional power in the country now. And it's like, I guess it's a bit of a black pill to admit it because it's so basic, but it's like, that's where we are. So you should adjust accordingly.
And even though a lot of listeners have complained about this before, when you make a profound point and I don't elaborate on it, I'm just going to say I agree and moving on. I can't wait to see the commenters like, Scott didn't elaborate it. We've got a production team's got a very narrow schedule, so we've got a lot of things to talk about. But we actually just have one more thing to talk about, and it's actually a patron question. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or a guest questions if you sign up for the patron option at Highly Respected's Patreon. This one comes from Dave. He asks, Scott, what do you think of Caitlyn Jenner running for governor? Do you think Con Inc. will get behind him? Well, the first question to the second question, yes. I mean, it's already happening. I was seeing several people who should know better are endorsing Caitlyn Jenner for some reason to own the libs. I mean, this is a joke candidacy. It's just another embarrassment for the Republican Party to even like consider this. Caitlyn Jenner doesn't even have any policies listed on their website. It's I don't know. It's another embarrassment. I think it is funny. It would be very funny if Caitlyn Jenner became the governor of California. I think it would fully cement America as clown country.
They deserve it. They deserve it.
Yeah, we deserve it. But outside of that, no. And anyone, but I unfortunately, Con Inc. is going to get behind Caitlyn Jenner, and that's just the nature of how the Republican establishment works. I hope people learn better and realize that, you know, one of the points of the dissident right is that we see someone like Caitlyn Jenner and realize that we don't want a society to pedestal these people. And there's no greater portrayal of that than endorsing that person's candidate, wanting that person to be governor of your state. You wouldn't even want this person to, like, you know, to have any authority over you, and you're wanting them to do that. And I think Nikki Haley's comment, getting mad at people making fun of her photo with Caitlyn Jenner, is illustrative of that. And you know, Nikki Haley's like, we're talking about conservative principles regardless of demographics. It was such a ham-fisted tweet that it looked like a rough draft of what a corporate PR department would say and on behalf of the conservative movement. And these are the only arguments they can say. I think that people are going to be more careful because I think the actual base of, you know, Trump voters does think that Caitlyn Jenner is a bridge too far, but I think they're still going to entertain it.
I mean, my biggest problem with it is that he's just going to be a cipher for Armenian-controlled government.
That's totally true. I mean, I can't. It's like California is just like a dead state. It's like there is no hope for the Republican Party there. It's just like leave California. And, you know, I mean, everyone's like saying, "Oh no, we don't want these like people coming to our state." But I mean, if like they're natural conservatives and right wingers, like there's no hope in your state. Just leave. Like, what do you expect to do by like? Oh, you got a Republican governor? Yeah, that's not going to reverse shit. Like that person's just is gonna rubber stamp whatever the insane state legislature proposes.
Watch him be based.
The state.
Watch him get in and be like incredibly based, like Candace, like a trans version of Candace Owens, where like he's just he has like his little rhetorical shield of being transgender, so he just becomes a trans fascist autocrat.
I mean, I could imagine that. That would be entertaining. Like, I would say that, like, if they go full Candace Owens, like if Caitlyn Jenner does that, like I would probably support that governorship just for the entertainment value alone. And that's the main reason to support is like you want this to expose clown country, and like the more Caitlyn Jenner does like wackier things they do, like if they go just like having Candace Owens as chief advisor, then I would probably be pretty it'd be good content.
We need to say this, Scott. I just need to give a shout out to our good friend, our brilliant astute analyst, future US refugee, who predicted that the future of politics in America was going to be the passing trans party versus the non-passing trans party. Now, he and we've been having an on and off debate about which party actually will constitute each respective category, but like the basic reading is that the Republicans will be the passing trans party and the Democrats will be the non-passing trans party. So far this is all it's all looking up refugee, just like every other one of these predictions. It always comes true. And I don't know, I feel like this cut a little too close. I feel like this came true almost like the minute he tweeted it. So everyone should look out for him on Twitter, because as
well, he's now a current U.S. citizen, though. He's not a future U.S. refugee. I guess he realized he couldn't flee, and he's just happy to be a current U.S. citizen now. But yes, give current U.S. citizen a follow. I think that's his ad. It may be just current citizen.
And I will support the passing trans to own the non-passing trans. That's going to be the new thing, to own the non-passing trans.
Yeah, libtards won't know what hit them.
Exactly.
But
they won't see me coming.
I guess that is, but yeah, Caitlyn Jenner for governor. That's our America. So thank God I'm in the land of the free, and that's the final. On that note, we're gonna wrap things up. Nightmare Vision, tell the people how to follow you and any final thoughts you have.
My last thought is that the 2028 election is going to be Caitlyn Jenner versus Kanye West, most likely. So everyone needs to, it's going to be very dramatic, familial dispute. The Armenians will be controlling both of them. They will both be a cipher. The Armenians will be the new CIA, and it will be like LBJ, JFK, but instead it will be Kanye West and Caitlyn Jenner. This is the future you chose. You cannot load a previous save. You can follow me, though, if you want to follow me, anyone, at God Close My Eyes. Yeah, it was great to be here, Scott.
Well, it was great to see you again, Nightmare, but we'll have you on again. But until next time, stay respected.